let's talk about some expectations before we get out of here real quick.
Sure.
For you, what should the expectations be? Because for me, I think you look at this transfer class and I think it helps you close the gap in terms of competitiveness. Does this get you over the hump to winning multiple Big 12 games for the first time in over a decade? I don't think so. I think you're still looking at this roster being in a place where can it be competitive in a lot of games? Yes. Is it good enough to get over the hump and beat some of these Big 12 teams? I just am not 100% sure yet. I think for me, when I look at the win total this year, I think it's set at 2.5. I do kind of like the over. I think 3 wins is probably where this team ends up. But I think any talk of 5, 6+ wins, I think is out of pocket. For you, like range of outcomes, expectations, where should those be for fans this fall, in terms of just you being realistic?
Top half of the bit. No, just the so here's my thing. Like I want to give you a direct win answer, but I really think it depends on September because Kansas has Tennessee Tech and you've got Duke, which are 2 very winnable games. Like I'm not saying Kansas should beat Duke because I think we can safely say over the last 12 years you can't really point to a single game and say Kansas should win that game.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a very real possibility that Kansas could be favored in that game or will be favored in that game, especially with Duke, new coaching staff, all of those different things. And so when you look at those two and you look at the game at West Virginia, now West Virginia is, if you take Kansas out of the equation, West Virginia would be my pick to finish last in the Big 12. And I get that it's at West Virginia. I think that we can sit here and say, yes, it was one game, and you hate to draw conclusions off of one game. Kansas played with West Virginia pretty well in the season finale. Kansas had no running backs for that game pretty much. Devin Neal did not play. And I think that even though West Virginia went and got JT Daniels this offseason, I think you could pretty easily make the argument that Kansas improved its roster more this offseason than West Virginia did from where they were at in November. And so when you look at that, I see the possibility of 3-1. At that point, I think it would be disappointing if you went 3-9. I agree with you. I do like the over. I think that if you come out of September 2-2, like we all, like most people probably expect, or Kansas people probably expect, I think it's fair to say that it could be 3-9. But I do think if you come out of September at 3-1, where you already have a win in your only Big 12 game so far, I think 4 is on the table. I really do. Whether that comes against an Iowa State team that's, has a lot of really good young talent. I think not a lot of people realize that.
No.
Iowa State is going to be significantly better, I think, in November than it is in early October. Whether you have a chance to do it against, say, like Texas Tech, new coaching staff, they've got a 3-way quarterback battle right now, which different things can happen. TCU, nobody really knows because of the way last year ended and all of those different things. Another place where you have a legitimate quarterback battle. And so I'm not saying Kansas is going to be favored in any of those games. I'm just saying if Kansas comes out of September 3-1 with the confidence that would come with going 3-1, I think you can make a case that Kansas is going to be in play for 4 wins at that point.
Yeah, and talking to some program sources, it sounds like that not necessarily the wins, but can you have that confidence and belief coming out of September? Because that schedule is so hard on the back half. It is so hard. You play Baylor, Oklahoma, Texas, Oklahoma State, all within kind of a very condensed stretch where I think in reality, I think if you're KU, you almost want some of those games early in the season because you can kind of take your lumps, and this staff has shown that they will improve over the course of a year. But to have those in kind of the crunch time part of the season is tough. I look at the West Virginia game being that litmus test for this season.
Sure, I agree.
I think, we talked to Shayon Jayaraja last week, and he talked about West Virginia and the fact that they played 2 rivalry games
Yep.
KU's sandwiched right in between those two. So if all of a sudden, if Neil Brown and the West Virginia team loses the first game of the season against Pitt on that Thursday, are they down? And then do they think, okay, well, we can just go beat Kansas, or are they coming in like, no, we have to go in and just blow out Kansas? Like, what mentality do they come into that game with? And so I look at that game being a big barometer, but I look at the schedule. You're
Yeah.
playing 11 Power 5 teams. That's the reality of what you're doing,
Sure.
right? Tennessee Tech is the only non-Power 5 team you're playing. Houston is a Power 5 team. They play in the AAC, but that roster Power 5. They're going to be
Sure.
in the Power 5. What is it, next season? So overall, I think you're looking at this schedule does not do KU any favors. I think that for me, I will measure success this season on the competitiveness. Can
Sure.
KU put a
Same.
competitive product on the field 9 out of the 12 games? That will be how I measure success, not the wins, because I think this roster is still in a place where it has these transfers now, but it's just not a place where I think it's going to be competitive or good enough to get the wins. Be good enough to be competitive, but maybe not get the wins. So, Kevin, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts on KU before we get out of here?
No, I actually thought that was a great way to describe it. I think that when we look back at year one, the Texas game is what everybody brings up, especially from like a national perspective
For
and
sure.
everything. But I think that when you look at it from a Kansas perspective, it probably started earlier than that. You saw flashes in the Oklahoma game. The Texas game was impressive in the way that went. Kansas was up at halftime against Duke, and just didn't have the depth. But I also think too, they were still putting in half a playbook, at that
Yeah.
point because they hadn't been there for the spring. And so when you look at the jump potentially from year one to year two, guys knowing where they're going, them not having to put in systems on the fly while also trying to decide, hey, can this guy even play at this level? You're deciding personnel stuff at the same time as scheme and trying to adjust to all those. And so when you add all of that together and the way that they close the game or close the year, I do think that competitiveness is going to be what we look at. And it's funny because it's not, improvement isn't linear. You don't just, it's automatically you're at this point, and so you're going to take a step up, and you're going to take a step up. And in Mangino's second year, Kansas went 6-6 and then went to the Tangerine Bowl and lost it. They were probably a better team in 2004 and went 4-7. They had a top 10 defense, I think, nationally. They played a lot of close games, but the close games didn't come out their way. And so you slump back and wind up only winning 4 games. Remember, that was the game where they lose to Texas in the final 30 seconds when Texas had Vince Young and went on to win a BCS game. And so when you look at all of that, I think it's very easy for people to look at it and say, okay, like Kansas was close last year, just turn those close losses into wins. The reality is that it's a little more incremental than that. And that sometimes, it doesn't work out quite that way where you're going from close games to close wins. Sometimes it goes the opposite, where maybe you've got a more close games next year, but they go against you. But I do think that you look at the competitiveness, specifically, and you referenced this earlier, against the teams in the Big 12 that Kansas is going to need to compete with to be a top half of the Big 12
Yes.
program. And not just this year, but going forward. And so look at where they're at. Kansas doesn't need necessarily, if you think Baylor is the best team in the Big 12 this year and Baylor was the favorite in the media poll, it's not that Kansas needs to play Baylor and lose 21-17. But how's Kansas playing against Texas Tech that's starting over with the new coaching staff? How's Kansas doing against Iowa State, which is in a transition year as some of those younger guys kind of get up to speed? How's Kansas doing against West Virginia, against TCU? How's Kansas doing against Kansas State? Because I think we've seen, over the course of that rivalry, it's not that they've never both been good at the same time, but it's they're almost never consistently good
Mm,
at the same time. And so if Kansas takes a big step against Kansas State and, makes the Wildcats sweat that game out in Manhattan, it might be another loss where you say, oh my gosh, they're adding to the streak, et cetera. But it might also be the sort of thing where you come away and you say, okay, maybe the gap's shrinking a little bit
yeah.
at the same time.